There you go, easy now. Drink up, little one. You're safe here.
Have you ever heard of a woman who, at 68, living alone in a remote cabin by a lake in the Wallowa Mountains, once cradled a baby Bigfoot in her arms? Not in a fairy tale. This story echoes through Oregon's forests, whispered among those who believe in the bond between human and wild. It began on a stormy spring night, when Rosalie Voss followed a strange, hoarse cry into the rain-drenched woods, and found a creature, barely weeks old, trembling beside its mother's lifeless body. With no one left in her world, she brought him into hers. She called him North. What few people know is this: North's mother wasn't killed by hunters, but taken down by tranquilizer darts, silent weapons from a private biotech team experimenting on cryptids. Rosalie and a local vet named Graham uncovered the truth and risked everything to keep North safe. This story, drawn from Graham's journals and town records long buried, is more than a myth. It's a quiet rebellion of the heart. It reminds us that real love doesn't always keep. Sometimes it lets go and leaves the door open for return. By the end, you may find yourself questioning, what really separates us from the wild? Could compassion bridge the distance? Where are you watching from? And how far can a story like this reach? To all of you out there, thank you for listening. From deep within the pines, we send our warmest love. The rain had been falling for days, not in violent sheets, but a slow, stubborn drizzle that seeped into the bones of the Wallowa Mountains and softened the forest floor into a sponge. The trees stood still beneath the gray sky, needles heavy with moisture, and somewhere beyond the haze, a loon called out, its cry long and hollow, like something searching. Inside a weathered cedar cabin tucked between two ridges, Rosalie Voss sat in silence with her hands wrapped around a cracked porcelain mug, steam from the tea rising into the lamplight. The air smelled of pine tar, old books, and something slightly sweet. Lavender from the sachet she tucked in drawers years ago and never refreshed. She hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. Rosalie, 68, had long since made peace with solitude, the kind of solitude that settled into your lungs and grew there like moss on stone. Her son, Julian, had been gone 13 years now. Afghanistan. Her husband, Henry, 4 before that. Heart attack in the garden. Since then, it was just her and the forest, and she didn't mind. Some days she played her husband's old records. Other days she wrote letters she never mailed. There was peace in that rhythm. The stove, the silence, the pages of worn books. Until that night when the rhythm broke. It was a sound. Not thunder, though the sky had grumbled all evening. Not a coyote, not an owl, not even the bark of elk in rut. This was different. She paused near the window, rain ticking soft on the glass. The cry came again, faint, high, almost human. Not quite a word, not quite an animal. Something between. She stayed frozen for a breath, 2. Her heart tapped once against her ribs, uncertain. She reached for her lantern, struck a match with the steadiness of someone who had lit thousands, and slipped on Henry's old field coat, the one still smelling faintly of cedar oil and smoke. Outside, the world was awash in wet silver. Leaves glistened. The trail to the lake shimmered in puddles. The cry came again, weaker this time, and she followed it without hesitation, boots sinking into soft earth, breath fogging into the damp night. Down past the birch split by lightning, through the fern hollows, to the edge of the lake where the moon, veiled behind the clouds, laid no reflection. There, just beyond the driftwood log, something moved. Small, curled, a lump of soaked fur, twitching. Rosalie stepped closer, the lantern held low, and saw the shape clearly now. A creature no bigger than a toddler, hunched over beside a larger body sprawled lifeless beside it. The adult had been powerful once. Broad chest, limbs like tree trunks, thick fur matted now with rain and streaks of blood. There was a wound just beneath the rib cage. Clean, surgical, not from a predator, not from a hunter's bullet. Rosalie knew enough to see it had been made with something meant to cut with purpose. The smaller one, the child, if that's what it was, shivered, arms wrapped around itself, head tucked down. Its fur clung to its body in wet clumps, revealing the outline of long limbs, oddly proportioned, hands with long fingers, feet half submerged in the mud. And the face, not an animal. Not entirely. Not a child either. It turned slowly toward her lantern glow, and Rosalie stopped breathing. Amber eyes met hers. Wide, frightened, too knowing. A primitive face, but with human-shaped contours beneath a fine layer of wet fur. The brow expressive, jaw small but defined, lips parted in quiet effort to breathe. It didn't cry now, just stared at her as if unsure whether she was danger or mercy. She stood in the rain, heart pounding, Henry's voice echoing in her skull. Don't interfere with what belongs to the wild. But that had never sat right with her, not even when he was alive. Not when she found a wounded doe once and nursed it through the winter. Not when Julian brought home a stray raccoon kit wrapped in his baseball jersey. She stepped forward. The small thing recoiled, its shoulders lifting in alarm, but it didn't flee. Couldn't. It was too weak. Its limbs trembled. There was blood at the corner of its mouth. Rosalie knelt beside it, her knees sinking into the moss. She reached for it slowly, carefully, letting her hand hover just above the creature's shoulder. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, though she knew it wouldn't understand. Or maybe it would. She couldn't say. The creature didn't move. She unfastened her coat and wrapped it around the childlike form, tucking in the long arms, lifting its frail weight into her embrace. It didn't struggle, just let out a sound, low, hoarse, not quite a whimper. Its breath was shallow. She could feel the faint rise and fall against her chest, like a moth trapped between cupped hands. Rosalie turned back toward the cabin, legs already aching from the walk and the weight. But she didn't care. The rain pelted her face. She walked fast, driven not by logic, but by something deeper, a hum in her chest, a knowing. By the time she made it back, her coat was soaked through, and the child was nearly still. She lit the hearth the old-fashioned way, paper, kindling, breath, and laid the creature down on the ragged wool blanket beside the fire. It looked even smaller now, limbs curled into itself, fur streaked with mud and something darker. She fetched the kettle, filled it, and set it on the stove, her hands moving without needing thought. As water warmed, she unwrapped the creature with care, revealing more details. Long feet, not hooved, not clawed, just different. Thin fur over the chest, scratches all down the side, a bruised jaw, a mark on its wrist, faint, like a small puncture. But she noticed it. When the tea was ready, she poured a cup, then filled a dropper with warm goat's milk and leaned close. The creature didn't react. She touched the dropper to its lips, coaxing one drop, then another. On the third, it swallowed. She kept going. 5 drops, 6, 7. The fire popped. Shadows danced across the wood-paneled walls. Rosalie sat cross-legged beside it, her legs numb, and drew the blanket tighter around them both. Hours passed. At one point, the creature stopped breathing. She felt it, that sickening stillness. She clutched it to her chest, rocking slightly, whispering words she hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Not yet. Not you." Her warmth against its back, her breath at its crown. She held it through the night like she once held Julian after his nightmares, like she once held Henry's hand in the hospital. At some unknown hour, the creature coughed, a sharp sound like something unclenching, and breathed again. When the gray light of dawn touched the windows, the creature stirred. Its eyes fluttered open. She felt it first, the shift of weight in her arms, and then she saw it. Those amber eyes blinking up at her, no longer terrified, just tired. She reached for a clean cloth, wiped the blood from its cheek, then smiled. It blinked once, and something passed between them, not understanding, but something close. She looked at it, really looked, and whispered, "You're from the north, aren't you?" The name came to her like breath. North. That's what she would call it. Not because of where it came from, but because of the way its breathing sounded in the dark, like wind over pine. Later that morning she called Graham Pike. He arrived an hour later, boots wet, face drawn. He hadn't been to her cabin in years, but she trusted him. Julian had too. When he saw the creature, he didn't speak at first, just crouched beside it, studying the limbs, the face, the half-closed eyes. Then finally, in a low voice, he said, "Rosalie, this isn't a wolf, and it's not human either. What you're holding, no one's going to believe it." "I don't care," she said. He looked at her, brows furrowed. "Someone heard it." "I know." He leaned closer, examined the mark on the small wrist, the thin puncture. "This isn't from a trap. This looks like anesthesia. Veterinary grade." Her pulse jumped. "You mean someone was trying to drug it? Or its mother," he said softly. "Whoever did this wasn't hunting for food. They wanted to take them alive." She said nothing. Just watched the fire flicker in the glass of the stove, her thoughts racing. "If people find out, Rosalie, they'll come for it. They won't let you keep it." She looked down at North, curled on the blanket, already breathing deeper. "Then they can try," she said, voice quiet but solid. "He needs me more than they ever will." Graham stayed for a while, checking the creature's temperature, helping her prepare more milk. When he left, the sun had broken through for a moment, casting warm light through the lace curtains. Rosalie watched the dust rise in the beam and thought of Julian, of the weight of loss, and the small chance of healing. Later that day, when she cleaned the coat she had wrapped around North, she found something caught in the fabric, a small plastic cylinder no larger than a pinky. She turned it over in her palm. There was a number etched into the side. A serial code. Not hunting gear, not medical waste. Something clinical. Something marked. Her stomach turned cold. Outside, the forest moved in quiet patterns. Birds returning to branches, frogs chattering at the lake edge. But in Rosalie's cabin, a new silence settled. Not empty, not lonely, but brimming. A kind of breath held between one world and another. She looked down at the small figure curled beside the fire and whispered, "You're safe now. Whatever you are. You're safe here." But far off in the trees, unseen in the drizzle, something watched. Something taller than any man, broader than any bear, still as stone, watching the cabin window, waiting. Morning broke slow and gray across the Wallowa Range, with mist clinging low to the valley and dew pooling in the grooves of every fallen pine needle outside the cabin. The storm had passed, but the chill lingered in the damp air, pressing against the windows like a silent visitor not ready to leave. Inside, the fire from the night before had burned low, glowing softly beneath a veil of ash, casting the room in the faintest gold. Rosalie sat motionless in the rocker near the hearth, the tips of her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the wool blanket beside her, where the creature still slept, or something close to sleep. Its breath rose in shallow waves, barely disturbing the fringe of fur along its back. She watched the way the light caught in its wet fur, now drying in slow patches, revealing scratches and clotted wounds across its ribs and shoulders, some old, others raw. There was dirt crusted into the creases of its long fingers. The blood from its mouth had turned rusty overnight. She rose carefully, joints aching, and stepped into the kitchen. The floor creaked beneath her heels. She filled the kettle from the tin pitcher and set it on the stove, letting the hiss of flame and the hum of water warming soothe the knot behind her ribs. She moved slowly through the routine. Tea, cloth, basin, milk warming on the back burner, all while keeping the corner of her eye on the still form wrapped near the fire. She hadn't slept. She didn't feel tired, just sharpened. She dialed the old rotary phone on the kitchen wall. The cord stretched like a tired vine. The line clicked once, then again. A voice answered, rough with sleep but familiar. "Graham," she said, "I need you to come out here." He was quiet for a beat. "Rosalie, I've got something. An injured animal, I think. You need to see it." He didn't ask questions. He never did. "Be there in an hour." When she hung up, she pulled the wool blanket back with care and checked the creature's pulse again. Faint, thready, but there. She wet the cloth with warm water and dabbed along the creature's brow, around the eyes, down the neck. Its fur was thicker along the arms and thighs, but softer at the face, where skin peeked through in pale, bruised patches. The jaw was human-shaped, small and fine. The nose, broad but flat. The eyes fluttered now and then beneath their lids. She wasn't sure it was conscious. The milk had cooled to just above body temperature. She filled the eyedropper and knelt beside the fire. One drop at the corner of its mouth, another, a third. Its lips trembled, then parted, and it swallowed. Rosalie felt something in her chest release. The tension hadn't lifted, not entirely, but it shifted. She fed it again, then bundled it tighter in the blanket. It made a small sound, deep in the throat, like a sigh through dry leaves. When Graham pulled into the clearing, his truck tires crunched softly on the wet gravel. Rosalie met him at the door, her boots still damp from the previous night, hair pulled back in a loose tie. He carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and wore the same green jacket he always did, the one with the torn cuff. His eyes were bloodshot. He stepped inside and stopped cold, looking toward the fire. The creature hadn't moved. "What am I looking at?" he asked, voice low. "I don't know," she said. "But it's not a raccoon, and it's not a child." He moved closer, crouched down beside it. He didn't speak for a long while, just watched it breathe, studied its limbs, the length of its fingers, the structure of its knees, the shape of its skull beneath the drying fur. Then he exhaled, a long, slow thing, and sat back on his heels. "Rosalie," he murmured, "this is something no one's ever seen before, or at least, not alive." He reached into his bag, pulled out a stethoscope, and began checking vitals. His movements were careful, practiced, but Rosalie saw the tremble in his jaw. He pressed gently against the bruised rib cage, then stopped at the wrist. "What's that?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Just leaned in, parting the fur. "It's a puncture mark," he said finally. "Too small for a tranquilizer dart. Too clean for a branch. This looks surgical, like anesthesia. Veterinary grade." Her stomach turned. "You think someone drugged it?" "Or its mother," he said. "I've seen this kind of wound before, usually on test subjects." Rosalie swallowed hard and stared at the blanket. The weight of what he wasn't saying settled heavy in the room. "Someone was experimenting?" she asked. He didn't answer. Didn't have to. She rose and poured tea for both of them. They sat at the kitchen table while the creature slept. The rain had started again, barely more than mist. It whispered on the rooftop, soft and constant. "I'm calling it north," she said finally. Graham glanced at her, surprised. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because when it breathes, it sounds like the wind through the northern trees." He gave a small nod, turning the cup in his hands. "It suits." After he left, Rosalie moved slowly through the cabin, covering the windows with thick cloths. She didn't know why, but it felt necessary. That evening, as she laid out fresh towels and lit the second lantern, she noticed something strange caught in the fold of her husband's old coat, the one she had used to carry the creature home. It was small, plastic, cylindrical. She turned it over in her hand. There were numbers etched on the side. A sequence, not a tag from a store, not a button or a piece of trash. It was a microdart, a piece of tranquilizer equipment. Her mind reeled. The wound, the mother, the precision. This wasn't some careless accident in the woods. Someone had hunted them, but not like the hunters in Joseph who chased deer and elk for sport or meat. This had intent. This was methodical. She looked back toward the fireplace. North hadn't moved, but its chest rose more easily now. It shifted once in its sleep, fingers flexing, mouth opening just enough to let out a sound. A low, breathy call, like a child murmuring in a dream. She moved closer, knelt beside it again, and placed her palm over its heart. She stayed there a long time. That night, as the fire roared higher and the wind picked up outside, Rosalie did not sleep. She sat in the rocker, knitting slowly, eyes on the small form bundled in wool and warmth. The light danced across its face, revealing those fragile features again. The curve of the nose, the short fuzz along the cheeks, the lashes trembling at every flicker of shadow. Its mouth parted once more, then closed. Its breathing was steady now. Not strong, but steadier. She thought of Henry and the way he used to sit by the fire with Julian curled against his side, reading from old field journals or maps of the mountain trails. She thought of Julian himself, wide-eyed and kind, always taking in strays. The world had never been gentle with those who led with kindness. She rose to check the stove, then paused. Something shifted at the window. She stepped softly across the room and lifted the edge of the curtain. The yard beyond the glass was dark, but not empty. Just beyond the tree line, at the edge where the mist gathered thickest, a shape stood, tall, unmoving, broad-shouldered and silent. Not human, not deer. Too large, too still. It didn't come forward, didn't make a sound, but it was watching. Rosalie let the curtain fall. She turned back toward the fire, toward North, and sat down again. The tension in her chest, now something deeper. Not fear, not quite. Something older, something like knowing. And still, through the rest of that long night, she sat there, unmoving, hand resting lightly on the creature's back, watching the fire rise and fall, while something waited in the trees. By the second week of July, the town of Joseph didn't feel quite like itself. The air still smelled like pine and barbecue smoke, but there was something colder beneath it now. It started with the cars, newer, cleaner, not local. They rolled in with tinted windows and polished bumpers, parked just off Main like they belonged. Men stepped out dressed casual enough to pass, plaid shirts, khaki pants, fleece vests. But their eyes didn't match their voices. Their smiles felt printed. Their boots didn't have dirt on them, and they never looked at the lakeside shops or the mountains like tourists do. Their eyes stayed fixed on the ridge lines, the tree lines. They were watching for movement, not scenery. And they didn't ask questions. They asked for cooperation. They showed up at the animal clinic first. Rosalie didn't hear it from Graham, not right away, but the news passed quick enough through the whispered channels of old locals. Backdoor visits, quiet conversations, polite offers that sounded like promises but tasted like bribes. They came in with folders and grant proposals, said they were part of a program backed by a private conservation firm focused on rare species monitoring, said they could help fund Graham's clinic, new equipment, satellite imaging, lab services. Said it would be good for the region, said it would make Oregon proud. They knew exactly how much debt Graham was in, knew about his mother's condition down in La Grande, knew what buttons to push. They handed him a brochure printed on heavy matte paper, embossed with the insignia Tamsin had sketched. Triangle, pine tree, the words Wildlife Recovery Project wrapped around in a neat curve. It looked official enough to fool most folks, but Rosalie knew better. Real science didn't come with people who smiled too long and left no footprints. She didn't ask Graham what he said to them. She could see it on his face a few days later when he came by. Eyes sunken, hands shaky as he checked North's bandages like his fingertips didn't trust themselves anymore. He didn't bring new supplies. He didn't stay for tea. When he left, he paused at the door a little too long. "They're serious, Rosalie," he said. "They've got money, drones, tranquilizers, contracts. People in town are already talking like it's a done deal." "What kind of people?" "Sheriff, land surveyors, park board." "And what do they want with him?" He didn't answer, just glanced toward North, who was curled up near the hearth, watching silently. Then he said, softer, "You can't keep him hidden forever." Rosalie stared at him for a long breath. "You didn't used to sound like them." Graham closed the door without another word. That night Rosalie stayed up late. The oil lamp dimmed low, sorting through old things. Maps, receipts, photographs she hadn't touched since Julian died. Her hands moved automatically, but her thoughts stayed on the strange whirring she'd heard outside the cabin at dusk. It hadn't been a bird or the usual mosquito whine. It was mechanical, subtle, high up. The next morning she walked out toward the creek for water and stopped short beneath the spruce tree near the bend. Something glinted in the light. Something square, hidden up among the lower limbs. She climbed the slope and found it. A thermal recorder, bolted to the underside of a limb with a rust-colored bracket. Old model, government issue. Not something you'd buy at the hardware store, not something meant for game tracking either. It had a receiver attached, small and black, with a flashing green LED. She brought it back to the cabin and cracked it open with Henry's old screwdriver. The memory chip inside was labeled in small print, WR712, thermal plus bioacoustic. She knew enough to recognize the terms. They weren't just tracking heat. They were listening. Rosalie didn't tell North. He had grown more alert lately, eyes darting to every sound, shoulders twitching at branches creaking outside the windows. He knew something had changed. When he stood now, he was nearly her height. His movements were faster, more deliberate. He could climb the pantry shelves without knocking a single jar loose. And when he sat cross-legged by the fire, he folded his long arms across his knees like a young man thinking his way through a world he didn't trust. Later that day, as she hung laundry out to dry, she saw him staring out toward the ridge again, his head tilted, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer, just exhaled through his nose, low and steady. She followed his gaze and saw nothing, but the hairs on her arms stood up. By sundown, the air had shifted again. Thicker, still. That kind of quiet you only notice when it's already too late. She cooked a light supper, barley stew and cornbread, and barely touched hers. North ate slowly, still watching the window. His ears twitched once, twice. Then, without warning, he stood up, turned toward the door, and froze. Rosalie followed his gaze. There was a flicker, red, quick, just a flash near the trees, then gone. She blew out the lamp and crossed to the door. The porch creaked as she stepped outside, letting her eyes adjust. Nothing moved. The trees were motionless, the air too quiet. Then she saw it again. A small red dot, barely noticeable, suspended for a blink in the mist, like the glint off a rifle scope. She stepped back inside and bolted the door. North stood behind her, breathing fast. She crouched and took his hand. It was shaking. "It's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure it was. "We're not alone, but we're not helpless." She left a message for Graham that night, short, quiet. "They're here." The next morning, he came early. His truck parked farther down the path, half concealed behind the alder grove. His boots were muddy, jacket stained with pine sap. He didn't ask permission to come inside, just stood in the doorway for a long second before stepping through. "I made a mistake," he said. Rosalie didn't move. "They said it was research, that no one would get hurt, that they'd just observe. I thought maybe they knew more than us." "Do they?" No, he said. They know less, but they don't care. He sat at the kitchen table, resting his head in his hands. They're not studying him. They're hunting him. Rosalie nodded. And yet you signed. He looked up slowly. I'll get out. I'll undo it. They don't let people undo things like that, she said softly. Graham stared at the fire. North was in the corner, half hidden, watching them both. There's more, he said. I heard them talking, not in front of me. But I listened from the back hall. They want to take a specimen, that's what they called it. Said they missed the mother, but they still had a chance with the young one. Rosalie closed her eyes. They're not just here, he continued. They've got sensors all over the eastern ridge, traps, drugged bait, camera drones that fly low at night. And you're telling me this now? I didn't know how to tell you before. Yes, you did, she said. You just didn't want to lose your clinic. He didn't argue. She stood and walked to the window. The trees were still, the air motionless. We don't have much time, she said. Graham rose, his voice strained. Whatever I did, I'll fix it. If they come, I'll stand in their way. Rosalie turned to him. You'll need to do more than stand. You'll need to walk away from everything. He nodded slowly, as if just realizing the weight of what she meant. That night, the fire crackled low, and the cabin felt smaller than ever. Rosalie sat in the rocking chair, knitting with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew what they had to do. The men who don't ask questions were getting closer, but they weren't the only ones watching. Out past the trees, beneath the layered dark of pine and fir, something else waited. Not silent, not gone, just waiting, and it was ready to move. By late August, the mountains were dry to the bone, and the sky held a constant pale glare like it was bracing for thunder but never letting loose. The air smelled of dust and resin, everything brittle and waiting to snap. Rosalie moved slower now, as if the heat had baked into her joints, but her eyes missed nothing. Each morning she walked the lower ridge, checking the game trails for changes, and each night she adjusted the curtains by half an inch, never fully closed, never fully open. There were patterns to keep, habits that weren't for comfort anymore. They were for survival. And always, she checked the moss paths to see if they had been touched. North had grown leaner and stronger. His gait was more upright now, his eyes sharper. His face, that human-like wild man face, held something older than a boy's defiance. It was the face of something watching both worlds and trusting neither. He still didn't speak, but his presence had become language enough. At night, he sat at the far end of the porch, elbows on knees, staring toward the dark pines, listening. Sometimes she thought he was waiting for something. Sometimes she thought he already knew what was coming. Graham had returned twice since the visit from the wildlife recovery men. He didn't come through the front anymore. He used the back path, the one hidden by the fallen birch. He brought supplies and news, but the guilt hung off him like soaked canvas. Rosalie didn't ease it. She had other things to do. They built the false trail together over 2 days. Rosalie had gathered moss by hand, packing it into a bucket lined with burlap. Graham mixed charcoal and wood ash into the seams to mimic soil scuffs. They made marks on trunks with old elk bones and pressed boot heels into soft patches, staggered and deep. It had to look like they were hiding something, but not well. Just enough to be found, just enough to bait. It was a trap, but not for the creatures these men were used to catching. North stayed back while they worked, watching from a rise above the trail. He didn't interfere, but he saw everything. The way Rosalie's shoulders tightened when Graham spoke, the way her hand paused at each knot she tied. There was a heaviness in her that hadn't been there before. When they finished, the sun was dipping below the ridge, casting everything in a harsh orange smear. The scent of scorched pine needles lifted in the heat. They stood in silence, looking at what they'd made. A lie shaped like a trail. A map for wolves who called themselves scientists. "You sure this'll pull them?" Graham asked. Rosalie's voice came quiet. They've been waiting for an excuse to move. This gives them one, that night. Something shifted. It wasn't a noise. It wasn't even a movement. Just a silence that fell heavier than usual. Rosalie felt it in her chest before she noticed North was gone. The back door hadn't creaked. No footprints in the dirt. Just his absence. A space too quiet. A heat missing from the corner near the fire. She grabbed the lantern and stepped outside. The sky above was heavy with stars, but the air felt sharp, like the forest was holding its breath. She moved quickly, following the edge of the trail, past the creek, past the huckleberry patch. Her breath grew short. Her legs burned. She found nothing. And then the ground fell away. The trap wasn't built for her, but it didn't care. She didn't even feel herself falling. Just the jolt, the sudden slam of her shoulder hitting packed soil, the flare of pain through her rib cage. Her mouth filled with dust. The lantern cracked, glass splintering beside her. She tried to move, but the world spun sideways, red and buzzing. From above, a beam of white light sliced through the dark. Too still to be a flashlight, too wide to be a headlamp. It stayed locked on her chest. Then a voice, calm and cold. Target acquired. Her heart stopped. Boots crunched above. Someone muttered into a radio. She couldn't see his face, just the outline of gear and the glint of a metal barrel. Then another figure moved beside him, raising something long and silver. She tried to speak, but her voice was thin, airless. And then the light shifted, not upward, but sideways. Swung hard. A shadow moved, fast, too fast. There was a sound, low and guttural, like a boulder tearing free from earth. And then bodies thudded against bark. One of the men screamed. The other didn't get the chance. Through the dirt and pain and blur of light, Rosalie saw it. Massive arms, broad shoulders, fur like river stone under moonlight. And that face, lowered toward her, human like wild man face, amber eyes sharp with fury and worry. Both. Harbor. He reached down, his hand bigger than her chest, and cradled her side without pressure, lifting her like a fallen bird. She felt the warmth of him, the sheer weight and control in the way he moved. He didn't run. He carried, careful, swift, like someone retrieving something sacred. The wind picked up as he stepped through the trees, and Rosalie let herself fade, her head pressed against his shoulder, the scent of wild cedar filling her lungs. When she woke, it was morning. Graham was wiping blood from her temple with a wet rag. The cabin was dim. The fire was lit. The pain in her ribs was sharp, but her mind was clear. She sat up slowly. "He saved me." Graham nodded. "I know." Rosalie looked around. "Where's North?" "He came back after," Graham said. "He's outside, watching." She reached for a cup of water, her hands still shaking. "They were going to take him," Graham said quietly. "Not hurt him, extract him." Rosalie turned her eyes to him. "Same thing." He swallowed, jaw tight. "I saw the plans, containment protocols. They weren't even calling him by name, just numbers, measurements, sample potential." "Is that what you signed up for?" Graham didn't answer. Outside, wind shifted through the pines, brushing past the bare grass bundle still tied to the porch beam. Rosalie stood, each movement a jagged breath, and stepped to the door. North was there, crouched at the edge of the porch, his body still, his eyes alert. When he turned to look at her, something in her chest broke open, not from fear, not from pain, but from something deeper. Something like knowing. She walked over, placed her hand on his shoulder. "You have to go soon," she said. "But not yet." He blinked once, slowly. Behind them, Graham leaned against the wall, his shoulders heavy. He didn't speak. Rosalie turned to him. "This wasn't just about survival. He saved me before I even fell. He chose mercy over vengeance." "I know," Graham said. "He didn't touch me. Could've, should've." Rosalie nodded. She looked out at the trees, then back at the boy. No longer a child, not yet a man, but something else entirely. "All we have left," she said, "is compassion. And if that's the only thing standing between us and extinction, then we better hold on to it." She didn't say what she was thinking. Not yet. That North's father had saved her without hesitation. That his son had trusted her enough to come back. That the people watching from the ridge only saw data where there was dignity. She would say it when it mattered. For now, she walked inside, lit another lamp, and began packing the things that mattered most. The wind outside shifted again, not with menace, with warning. By the time September reached the hills, the wind had changed its tone. It wasn't the hard, dry breath of late summer anymore, but something slower, gentler, moving through the trees like a warning softened by age. The ridge above the cabin was on fire with yellow and orange, and the old black oaks along the creek dropped their leaves like they'd seen too many years to care about holding on. The light in the mornings came in gold, stayed low, and didn't last long. Rosalie watched the shadows stretch farther each day. She felt it in her bones too, the shift, the thinning. And she knew. North was almost as tall as she was now. His shoulders had broadened, his back straighter. The way he moved through the cabin had changed. Less like a guest, more like someone passing through. He still slept near the hearth most nights, but the way he curled in on himself had softened. He no longer trembled in sleep, and he no longer leaned into her hand when she touched his shoulder. Not because he didn't need her, but because he was already halfway gone. She saw it in his eyes every morning when he stepped outside barefoot, standing still at the edge of the porch, just listening. To the crows, to the rustle in the brush, to the far-off sound of water that no one else noticed. And sometimes she caught him glancing toward the ridge where the moss paths used to be. He didn't need those anymore. The direction was already inside him. She didn't say anything. Not yet. She kept doing the ordinary things. Warming goat's milk for breakfast, sweeping the porch, stacking firewood. She fixed the drawer in the pantry that stuck when it got cold. She re-stitched the elbow of the old wool coat. She polished Henry's lantern even though she hadn't lit it in weeks. But her hands felt slower now, like every gesture was holding something back. One afternoon, she stepped outside with a small bundle of bear grass. The stalks had dried to pale green, curling slightly at the ends. She sat on the steps and began to braid them, fingers moving without thought. She didn't look up until North crouched beside her. He tilted his head, watching. She could feel his breath close, quiet and steady. She tied the braid with a piece of cotton string, looped it tight, and without a word, reached up and hooked it onto the wooden post of the porch, just beneath the overhang. She stood. He did too. Their eyes met. That was the moment. She knew it without needing a sound. That braid wasn't just a decoration. It was permission, an offering, a sign that the door was open and would never be locked. She had no words to give him, but she didn't need them. Every morning shared, every scar wrapped, every look exchanged. That had been the language all along. That night, the wind rose early. The air tasted of dry leaves and lake stone, and the lantern inside the cabin flickered even though the windows were shut. Rosalie sat at the table with her tea growing cold in her hands, staring past the walls. She didn't know what time they'd come, but she felt it. And she waited without fear. When the knock came, it wasn't on the door. It was soft, low, a rustle of movement just beyond the trees. Not a call, not a cry. Just the sound of breath and weight moving across pine needles. She stood, moved slowly to the window, and looked out. They were there. Harbor stepped from the darkness first. His height was more than memory now. He filled the space between the trees like an old mountain returning to its place. His fur glinted faintly in the moonlight, silver and dark, and his shoulders rolled with age and strength. His human-like wild man face was solemn, unmoving, but not cold. His eyes, those amber eyes, held patience, Behind him, two more shapes, smaller. A female, broad-hipped, with a narrow face and softer shoulders. And beside her, a small figure half her size, its hand gripping the fur at her side. Rosalie opened the door without a sound. North stood behind her, already knowing. She stepped aside. He walked past her, slow, deliberate. His hand brushed against her arm. Not for balance, not for thanks. Just contact. Just a moment to say he had not forgotten. He stepped down into the yard, where the moonlight caught the edge of his face and made the fine fur along his jaw shimmer like frost. He paused once, turned back. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something clear and old. Not sorrow, not joy, but the gravity of change. He stepped forward again, past the porch, toward the trees. Harbor met him halfway. They didn't speak. They didn't touch. They just looked at one another like two branches from the same fallen tree, grown in different directions but still tied at the root. North turned slightly, eyes searching until they landed on Rosalie again. He walked back to her slowly. He raised one hand, large and warm and worn, and rested it gently on her shoulder. He leaned in, his forehead nearly touching hers. Then, with a final glance, he stepped away. The forest closed behind them like a curtain drawn with care. Rosalie didn't cry. She didn't move. She stayed on the porch until the light changed. In the morning, a knock came again, this time at the front door. Tamsin, out of breath, her braids undone, her shoes muddy. "They're heading to Hell's Canyon," she gasped. "The ones with the trucks. I heard them say it. They're setting up traps. They know about the others." Rosalie didn't blink. She walked to the table, picked up the wool scarf Henry used to wear, folded it tight into her bag. She took down the small box of maps from the shelf. She slid her old hunting knife into her boot, then turned to Tamsin. "Where exactly?" The girl pointed toward the south. Rosalie nodded. She stepped back out onto the porch and paused. The beargrass braid still hung from the post, damp with morning dew. Strands curled from the weight of the night air. It looked smaller now, but not less real. She touched it once with her fingers, not to untie it, just to remember. Then she turned back toward the cabin and closed the door behind her, but not fully, not locked. Just enough to say, "This place still remembers you." And she picked up her pack, because what needed to be done next wouldn't wait for another sunrise. The road to Hell's Canyon wasn't marked on most maps the way Rosalie knew it. It started as a dusty shoulder off Forest Route 39, narrowed into gravel, then bled into dirt and switchbacks the deeper they went, winding between cliffs that fell away into shadow. Rosalie sat in the passenger seat of Graham's truck, with the window cracked just enough to feel the shift in elevation. The air grew sharper the farther they climbed, full of dry pine and old basalt dust. In the back seat, Tamsin sat quiet, arms wrapped around her backpack, eyes fixed on the blur of trees passing in the dark. No one talked much. No one had to. They left before sundown. By the time they crossed the last ranger outpost, it was dark enough that the canyon swallowed everything but headlights. The moon was thin, just a sliver, and the stars hadn't come out yet. Graham killed the radio an hour ago. There was only the sound of tires crunching rock, the occasional knock of pine boughs against the truck frame, and the wind sneaking through every crack in the cab like it had secrets to tell but didn't trust any of them. Rosalie held a small wooden box on her lap. Inside were the old thermal data cards she'd recovered from the recorder behind her cabin. She'd wiped the timestamps, shuffled the logs. Enough to mislead, not enough to erase. She needed the wildlife recovery team to believe their information had betrayed them, that the trail now led to the eastern basin of the canyon, not where Harbor had taken North's family. "They'll come here first," she'd said to Graham before they left. "They won't risk heading west unless they're certain. We give them a clear direction, a trap like the one they set for me. Only this time, the ground gives out under them." Graham hadn't said yes or no. He just loaded the truck. Tamsin had insisted on coming. "I heard them talking," she said, standing in Rosalie's yard with her fists clenched, dirt on her elbows. "They're setting up traps near the cliffs. If you go alone, they'll catch you too." Rosalie had looked at her long, then nodded once. Some truths didn't need adult mouths to carry them. Now the canyon opened up ahead, wide and black, like a mouth swallowing the last light of day. Hell's Canyon was the deepest gorge in North America, deeper even than the Grand Canyon, but it didn't boast. It just existed, old and uncaring, carved by time and pressure and things no one understood. The walls dropped away on either side of them into smoke-colored voids, and the ridgeline ahead broke into jagged silhouettes against a sky that hadn't quite let go of its color yet. Graham stopped the truck a quarter-mile from the ridge. They got out slowly. No slamming doors, no flashlights. They moved like shadows. Rosalie took point, her boots sinking into dry soil. The trail here was tight and slick from weeks without rain. She followed it past the deadfall, past the old fence posts that used to mark the grazing boundary. At the edge of a bluff, she paused and knelt. From her coat pocket, she pulled out the tampered data chip and the small wireless transmitter Graham had rigged to look like wildlife recovery tech. She planted it beneath a cracked boulder facing north, just where the drop-off began. "That should light them up like fireflies," Graham whispered behind her. She didn't answer, just straightened and looked out across the dark basin. Fog had started to gather below, low, wide, and heavy. It clung to the roots of the canyon like a breath held too long. Tamsin crept up beside them, pointing. "Down there," she whispered. "I see their lights." And they were there. Faint glows moving through the fog, slow and calculated. Too even to be hikers, too cold to be locals. "They're spreading," Rosalie said, "trying to flush them uphill." Graham took out the binoculars. "They've got 4 heat sensors, 2 sedative drones, big netting in case they spook something fast. They're expecting something big, probably hoping for Harbor himself." Rosalie stepped back. "Then we give them what they're looking for." She moved quickly along the ridge toward the old trail junction, where the rock face jutted out in a knife blade angle. Below, a narrow ledge ran east, barely visible through the fog. She had walked it once with Henry when they were young, back before the landslide in '78 made it too dangerous. It was narrow, unstable, but not impassable. She crouched behind a log, pulled out the last piece of the setup, an old wind chime from her porch, wrapped in bear grass, tied with thread. She hung it from a dead branch and waited. Below, the men moved closer. One of them stepped too fast, sending a small cascade of stones tumbling. Another snapped a twig. They weren't used to moving quiet. And then, through the haze, something shifted. A man shouted. Another flashlight spun upward, catching nothing but fog and panic. From the cliff's far edge, a form appeared, tall, massive, outlined in mist. Harbor. He didn't charge. He didn't growl. He just stood there, 1 foot on the slope, 1 hand at his side, breath rising in slow clouds. The closest man froze, then stepped back. His partner raised a rifle, but Harbor didn't move. Then, slowly, the massive figure lifted a hand and pointed. Not at them, but at the net they'd laid out behind them. Like he was telling them they'd caught nothing. Like he was showing them how much they'd misunderstood. One of the men lowered his weapon. The other hesitated. And then the one closest to the drop, the younger one, face pale even from this distance, slipped. His boot caught a loose stone. His balance tipped. He flailed, grabbing at nothing, falling into open air. Harbor moved. No sound, no struggle, just a blur of muscle and motion. He leapt forward and caught the man by the forearm mid-fall, slamming his weight backward, anchoring himself against the rock. The other men shouted. One ran to help, but it wasn't needed. Harbor pulled the young man up, slow and steady, until he lay sprawled on the ledge, gasping, alive. Rosalie watched from above, heart pounding. The young man looked up into the face that had saved him. That face, human-like wild man face, covered in mist and moonlight, eyes calm and strangely gentle. And in that moment, the man dropped his gun. He didn't run. He just backed away, knees shaking. The others looked at him, then at Harbor, then at one another. No words were spoken, but one by one they turned. They didn't pack their traps, didn't collect their sensors. They just left. Rosalie exhaled for the first time in minutes. Then her legs gave out. Graham caught her before she hit the ground. "We need to move," he said. But she was already fading, her body giving in to the pain she'd pushed through for hours. Behind them, Tamsin's flashlight swept low. "She's bleeding!" A thin line ran down Rosalie's side, where the strap of her pack had rubbed raw, torn open an old wound. North appeared then, stepping through the trees, eyes wide, breath ragged. He moved to her side and knelt, and in that moment, he placed himself between her and the rest of the canyon. Between the last men retreating and the woman who had opened the gate. He didn't roar. He didn't raise his fists. He just stood tall, silent and still, until they were gone. Rosalie opened her eyes just enough to see the glow of his form against the dark. She smiled through cracked lips, whispered something only he could hear. "You go now, sweet boy. I'll be all right." Then she let herself fall into the night, into the hush of the canyon wind. The fog rose to meet her, and somewhere far below, the river kept running. It was the kind of fall morning that didn't ask permission to be still. The leaves had already turned, most of them laid flat on the ground like quiet confessions. The light slanted low and golden through the trees, and the cabin sat in it like it belonged to no one. The smoke from the chimney was gone. The shutters half latched. The rocking chair out front sat crooked on its back legs, unmoved for hours. And Rosalie Voss was gone. Graham had driven up from Joseph before sunrise, cradling a basket of apples in the passenger seat, still warm from the kitchen oven where his mother used to bake this same time every year. He parked where he always had, just shy of the stump she used to mark with orange string, and climbed the porch without knocking. The door creaked open when he touched it. No lock, no resistance. Just the scent of dried sage, cedar, and the faintest breath of chamomile. The kind of scent that lingered after a long, good life. He found her on the porch chair, her favorite wool blanket folded across her lap, hands resting gently on top. Her face turned toward the trees, soft and empty of pain. Eyes closed like she'd been listening to the forest's last breath of night and drifted off before it finished. The steam in the mug beside her had dried to a ring. The fire inside had long since gone to ash. He didn't speak, didn't touch her, just sat on the porch rail a moment and looked out at what she had left behind. It wasn't silence. Not exactly. There was something else, something living. When he rose, he noticed the moss path. Barely there, a trail of green flattened in places that hadn't been touched since spring. It began at the edge of the woods and wound in a perfect line all the way up to the porch steps. He followed it with his eyes. At the top step, nestled against the post just beneath the wind chime, was a fresh braid of bear grass, still damp with dew. Graham stepped down, walked the edge of the path slowly, listening with more than his ears. When he reached the tree line, he paused, and there they were. Not hiding, not looming, just present. North stood at the front, taller now, taller than any man Graham had known, broad through the shoulders, powerful in a way that didn't threaten but warned. His fur had darkened with the season, streaked in places with soft silver, the wind catching the edges like a halo. But it was his face that stopped Graham cold. That human-like wild man face, now mature, shaped by grief and years and understanding. And still, somehow, kind. Beside him stood a female, eyes alert, with a younger one pressed against her hip. And beside that young one, another even smaller, barely half-grown, clinging to a thick lock of fur with a hand that looked nearly human. They didn't speak, but something passed between them anyway. North stepped forward, just one slow stride, and placed his palm across his own chest, fingers splayed, head bowed slightly. It wasn't submission. It was memory. Graham understood. That was the gesture Rosalie used, always had, when she thanked someone and couldn't find the words. North turned then, reached back for the smallest child's hand, and walked with them into the woods. One step, two. The branches closed behind them without a sound. Graham stood there a long while after they were gone. When he finally turned back to the cabin, the sun had risen a little higher. He walked up the steps again, past the bare grass, past the prints on the moss. He stepped inside and found her notebook on the table, the same notebook she used to record small things. How many deer came through the yard, the way the moon looked on the pond, what kind of soup she made the night she found North. On the last page there was one sentence in her faded hand. If he ever returns, let the door stay open. Graham didn't touch it. He walked through the kitchen, placed the basket of apples on the counter, and opened the back window to let the breeze in. The curtains shifted a little like they recognized the air. He took down the kettle, rinsed it, filled it again. He didn't rush. Out front, the chime tapped gently against the wood. The trees rustled once, twice, then quieted. And somewhere out in the distance, far enough not to intrude, but close enough to be heard, a single knock echoed through the trees. Then another, then a third. Graham looked up. The cabin held its breath. The firewood still needed stacking. The porch needed sweeping. The door was open. And some promises were never meant to be closed. Some stories aren't meant to end with a door closing or a curtain falling. They live on, not because of what happened, but because of what they leave behind. This one was never just about the forest or the quiet cabin or the shadows that moved between trees. It was about something much quieter, something more lasting. It was about what happens when two worlds, built on fear of each other, choose instead to meet in the middle, not with words, not with force, but with the simplest of gestures, an open hand, an open gate, an open heart. In a world that moves too fast, that forgets too easily, we are reminded through stories like this that connection is the one thing we carry that doesn't wear down with time. It asks for no explanation. It asks only for care. The kind of care that's given without the need to be seen, the kind that listens without demanding to be heard. There's a rare kind of strength in compassion, and there's a quiet kind of courage in choosing mercy over judgment, presence over control. We are not so different from the things we fear. We're not so far from the things we don't understand. But sometimes, understanding doesn't require explanation. Sometimes, it just needs someone to sit still long enough to listen. And when that happens, when the noise quiets, when the fences fall, what's left isn't wilderness or civilization. What's left is trust. And trust, once given, has the power to outlive us all. In the end, it's not about the myths we chase or the monsters we make up. It's about the choices we make when no one is watching, the small kindnesses, the silent promises, the doors we choose to leave unlocked, not because we expect someone to return, but because we want them to know they always can. Thank you for walking this road with us. If this story touched something in you, if it made you feel, remember, or wonder, we'd love to hear what it meant to you. Leave a comment down below and let us know. Your thoughts matter more than you know. And if you'd like to journey with us again, make sure to subscribe and follow along. There's always another story waiting just beyond the tree line.